All right, so we have taken a look at the pre-flop scenarios, and we've seen kind of how our what our range looks like, how we should try to expand that range or contract that range depending on position, um, and also potentially what our opponent's range might look like. We've taken a look at the aggregated reports as a way of analyzing the data at a larger scope. And what is a great way of digging into the general strategy for a particular formation, and then narrowing to different the ways in which you might play different types of boards. Now we're going to actually dive into an individual hand, right? So what we're going to look at here is this Ace King 7 board. So we have this Ace King 7 board, and let's just take a look at the, let's first take a look at the ranges, right? So we can see our ranges here, and after card removal, we went down from 70-ish combos down to 54 combos. Our opponent has about 116 combos. We crush them on EV, right? So we have about 62% of the pot from an EV standpoint, and that's even out of position, right? So like we have this, we have 56% equity, but we win 62% of the pot from an EV perspective, meaning we are over realizing our equity, which is really hard to do when we're out of position. but we can do that because we have such a significant, not only just range advantage, but also a nut advantage on this board. Having all of our aces and kings and then ace king here, we have a significant advantage, and we have a lot of ace x as compared to our opponents on this particular board. And you can start seeing that in the types of hands, right? So looking at the types of hands that we have on this board, we have 12% of our range is sets versus just under 5% for our opponents. 6.4% of our range is two pair versus about 5.8% for our opponents. They have a little bit more top pair than us, but it's pretty comparable, 18.5% to just under 18%. We also have more king X than them, so we have a lot of second pair, whereas they have a range that's dominated with low pair and third pair type hands, right? So they have a lot of these queens, jacks, tens, nines, eights, 7x, 6, 5, 4, 3s, 2s, right? So they have a lot of these low, type hands. And then from a no-made hand perspective, we have more no-made hands, right? So, and that's where you can kind of see down here at the bottom of the range, they do kind of go above us from this equity graph here at the bottom, but for the most part, we generally outpace them from an equity standpoint overall. Just from a draws perspective, right? So we have more combo draws, so we have more of these, suited Broadway type hands. We have more ace X, comparable amounts of ace X suited hands, right? So this is kind of close, but we have more flush draws, we have more gut shots, we have more backdoor flush draws. We're gonna kind of, we have more draws than them. So with the fact that we have some good equity draws, with the fact that we have a lot of best hands, right? And if we kind of go through these equity buckets, we have way more best hands, way more good hands, and then they have way more weak hands and way more trash hands, right? Like that's a recipe for us just being able to bet more. With a breakdown of this. So, before we actually dive into the breakdown, let's just take a look overall. So overall, the solver is having us bet not betting at all with these larger sizing. So there's a little bit of betting, 8.8% of it is betting this larger sizing of 2/3 pot. But for the most part, when we're betting this 1/3 pot. And I would probably just simplify this. It doesn't look like there's any one particular hand that wants to be betting a larger sizing here. There's, the hands that are betting larger sizing here, it looks like there's a little bit of ace king, a little bit of these gut shot type hands of queen jack, queen 10, jack 10, and then a little bit of some of our pocket sevens, and 7x type hands here too. But for the most part, we're betting small, and I probably would just simplify this to bet all of this small. So drilling into this 60%, let's take a look at what hands we are betting versus what hands we are checking. And to do that, I'll take a look at this summary section, and I'm gonna sort this way to go start looking through from checking down to betting, because we know that we're betting a lot of hands in range, but it's more uncommon that we're actually checking. So the hands that we're checking, so jacks without a heart are hands that it looks like we are checking more frequently. Queens, particularly without a heart, we are checking a lot. Tens without a heart looks like we are checking a lot. Nines without a heart, we are checking a lot. So in general, right away, I can see it looks like one of the delineations of our strategy is pocket pairs that we have below these paired scenarios, these paired cards that we have here. We are more likely to check them without a heart. Queens and jacks, we are probably more likely to check them overall anyways, as we're not really worried about overcards coming. Whereas like tens, as we start getting down to tens and nines, it's more likely that we should be betting them as long as they have a heart than not, because another overcard can come, like a 10 could come if we have pocket nines, and that could improve some of our opponent's hands in our overall range. So folding out a hand like a 10, you're going to actually capture some of their equity that way. The reason it's delineating to the heart versus the ones without a heart, it's two reasons actually. One, the board can go runner hearts and you can make a flush, which is great. But secondly, if you do bet pocket nines with a heart here and you spike a 9, you can guarantee that you're not actually it's not going to be a flush completing 9 here. So it's likely going to actually turn your hand to the best hand, not make you have a second best hand, which could get very expensive. So we can start seeing the type of strategy we might want to be playing with some of these weaker pocket pairs that we have in range. Aces and kings can really do whatever they want on this particular board. When we start looking at our ace X type hands, so we are mostly betting, and I would just basically call this out and say I'm probably going to bet almost 100% of my ace X range here. I mean, there might be there's probably some merit here to these, and you can start seeing the solver do this as you start getting down to some of your really low ace X hands of checking here, right? And I think there is probably some merit to that. But we have enough of an overall edge here where we could probably be betting versus virtually all of our ace X range. Our king X range is betting a lot here too, and that's where it's starting to check a little bit more when we get down to the weaker king X hands, right? So we can start seeing which hands are actually checking back, or start checking when we have king X here in our range. Queen X. When we start looking at Queen X, Jack X, I'll use Queen 5 suited here as an example. So Queen X, Jack X, whatever the case may be. These are hands where we want to be betting this if we have some part of the board where we don't necessarily want to bet it if we don't have a part of the board, right? So basically diamonds and hearts want to bet. Spades and clubs do not want to bet on this type of spot. And again, obviously with hearts we have flush draws. If we have the diamonds, they're good cards to continue barreling if a diamond rolls off on the turn. So that's why we're betting more here with hands like Jack 8 of diamonds or Jack 8 of hearts than we are with the clubs and spades variety. And it's going to be pretty consistent for all of these suited type hands. You're going to see the hands that wrap around this 7 are very likely to just be betting more frequently here, because they can also be turning some of these middle cards that can turn into straight draws. And this is where, when you start diving into these hand analyses, you're going to start seeing general patterns just continuously come into play. So right here I have in my head, we want to be betting about 70-ish, 2/3-ish of our range. Which means we want some checks in our overall range. Now those checks are probably going to be from weaker value, right? So there's going to be some weaker value in range, like stronger, stronger no pair hands like Queen X, or weaker pairs, right? Like, queens, jacks, tens, nines, whatever the case may be. Those are going to have some good checks in range. Oftentimes on these ace king or two high boards, and then there's one dangler. We often like to bluff the dangler, right? Because these are cards where they're vulnerable to overcards coming, but we also have 5 outs, right? So other than outside of a hand like pocket nines, without a heart, has 2 outs and might only have 1 out against a flush draw. Whereas if you have 7-6, there are 2 more 7s that can come. There are 3 more 6s that can come. Only one of those is actually a heart, so you actually have more outs here so that you can turn potentially a winning hand. The hands that we are going to be checking in these spots here are more likely going to be the hands like the weaker value that we have, the weak one pair, the weaker pairs that we have, and then or the weaker high card hands that don't really have good barrel ability. The hands that we might want to bet more frequently in these spots are going to be obviously their top end value, are really, really good hands that we have in range. And then the hands that have reasonable enough equity or can turn reasonable enough equity that can continue betting, right? So these are like your flush draw hands are likely to want to bet, right? Because they can turn a heart and have the best hand, right? But like even if you have backdoor flush draws like diamonds, you can turn a diamond, and now you have a really reasonable hand for a turn barrel. If you have a hand like 10-8 or 8-6 or hands like that, those are really, really good betting hands because you could turn a straight draw, right? And you have a good straight draw where you can continue betting. The solver is looking beyond the flop. It's not just looking at its one particular decision. It's trying to have coverage over a wide variety of turns and rivers, and understanding that you're gonna have to have enough bluffs on turns. You're gonna have to have enough bluffs on river. These hands that can turn a lot of equity make really, really, really good bluffs on turns and rivers. You want to have coverage if the board runs out diamond. You want to have diamond flushes in your range. Also on this type of particular board, since we have so much top end value, we have aces, we have kings, we have ace king, we have ace queen, we have ace jack, ace 10, right? We have a lot of really, really, really good hands. We're going to have hands that want to get 3 streets, which means we need enough bluffs to be able to go alongside those hands for 3 streets. And that's not going to be possible if we're not choosing those hands appropriately. Let's say just kind of looking at this bet a third, we can see how our opponent will respond. So at equilibrium against betting a third, our opponent is supposed to be calling with queens, which I think we see. They're supposed to start folding hands as good as jacks, tens, nines without a heart, but they're supposed to keep continuing with a heart. They're obviously continuing all their ace X, their king X. They're continuing all of their 7X here. This is where I don't think you. I don't think you see some of these low cards here continuing as much as they probably should. The ones with a heart, so like 5s with a heart, like I don't think you see that. 5-5 with the 5 of hearts and 5 of diamonds, I don't think you see that calling 100% of the time, or even. And I definitely don't think you start seeing them raise that much, right? So this is where I want to start kind of like mentally, preparing in my head and saying, well, this is what an equilibrium response would look like. And knowing if my opponent's going to be folding more than this 30%, right? So if I can start identifying, well, maybe my opponent might fold a little bit more, right? And if they might start folding a little bit more and not have some of these hands in range and fold more, well, now I can start expanding my betting range and start betting more of those individual hands, right? If they're not going to raise as much, I can start betting a little bit more. And conversely, if they're going to be calling all of these hands, or if they're going to be calling too much, then maybe I shouldn't be betting some of these bluffs, right? Or if they're going to be, raising too much, I should be not potentially, betting some of those bluffs, or I should be, kind of checking a little bit more to have some traps in my range, right? So this is the kind of give and take that you want to start, playing with. you know, before they had this AI solve functionality, you really couldn't test that in here, but now you actually can. So, and we'll get into that in the next video, actually, where we start digging into, you know, kind of looking at adjustments that we might want to make here. But we can start getting a sense for how, you know, our opponents should be responding to this at equilibrium, and we can start, you know, kind of adjusting upwards or downwards based on how we think they might adjust upwards or downwards. And again, you know, looking at this give and take. Let's just take a look at our checking range, right? So, you know, I think it's a good thing to kind of, if we check, what do we think our opponent will bet? At equilibrium, we can see here that they're checking back very, very frequently. So there should be a high frequency check if we check. You know, the hands that they are betting, you know, it's presumably their, you know, a lot of their ace-x hands. But even though a lot of their ace-x hands are checking here, but you know, there is ace-x that is betting. There's some broadways that are betting. You know, obviously pocket sevens, you know, so like hands like sets, and you can take a look at the breakdown here to see, you know, sets and two pairs are obviously betting here, and then there's a lot of checking, you know, otherwise. You know, versus a bet, right? So we're facing some of these, like, you know, either 2/3 or 1/3 bet. So versus a 1/3, we're continuing very frequently, right? So we're continuing, and we're through a call often. You can see here we don't have a lot of hands, right? We don't have a lot of hands because we bet a lot on the flop, but we're calling and we're starting to fold hands like pocket 10. So pocket 10s without a heart is just a check fold, right? You know, pocket jacks without a heart turns into a check fold in a lot of cases, and that's fine. Don't feel bad about that in that spot there. Against the large bet, it's you know, queens without a heart is a check fold. Again, don't feel bad about that. That's part of this. And you know, sometimes you have queens, you 3-bet, and the board comes out ace king x, right? And that's just the nature of the beast. But you know, this is kind of how I would analyze this spot from an equilibrium standpoint. The next thing that I would do here, though, is and what I would do if I were working in a tool like PioSolver or GTO Plus is I would start customizing things based off of how I think my opponent might actually play, and you know, take a look at that. So you know, that's what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run this solve here. And we are going to test something out here, and we're going to actually run an AI solve. So we're going to kind of like start node locking a little bit and test out this, and we're going to start seeing, you know, how we might play a little bit differently if our opponent is deviating a little bit from equilibrium here. So stay with me, and we're going to wrap up this study section through GTO Wizard here in this next video, where we're going to focus on exploitative play.